on April 15, 1943, in the quiet Belgian countryside outside Mechelen, two German military trains met on the same stretch of track. One was carrying nearly 300 soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. The other was hauling fresh reinforcements, weapons, and fuel toward the Channel coast. Both were moving at full speed. Both believed the track ahead was clear, and both were catastrophically wrong. When the collision happened, it wasn't just metal that tore itself apart. The impact triggered fuel tank ruptures, ammunition detonations, and a rolling fireball that turned the night sky orange. Entire carriages were vaporized. Bodies were thrown into nearby fields. For hours afterward, explosions continued as trapped shells cooked off in the wreckage. German authorities would later classify the death toll, but witnesses estimated over 600 soldiers were killed or maimed in a single, horrifying moment. To Berlin, it looked like a tragic accident. To Belgian resistance fighters, it was a miracle. And to one man standing quietly several kilometers away, it was a successful conclusion of a weapon no army had ever planned for: time. His name was Henri Bosmans, and he was not a soldier, a bomber, or a gunman. He was a clockmaker. Before the war, Bosmans had owned a small shop in Antwerp where he repaired watches, grandfather clocks, and railway timepieces. He had learned as a child that trains didn't run on tracks. They ran on minutes. Every signal, every junction, every switch depended on clocks being synchronized down to the second. If time was wrong, steel would go blind. When the Nazis invaded Belgium in 1940, they didn't just seize railroads. They seized the clocks that governed them. German logistics ran on obsessive scheduling. Military convoys moved like the gears of a massive machine, each one clicking into place at precisely the right moment. That precision made them fast, efficient, and vulnerable. Bosmans realized something no one else did. If he could control the clocks, he could control the trains. He didn't need explosives. He didn't need weapons. He needed access. And he had it. Because when the Germans took over Belgian railways, they made one mistake. They didn't replace the local technicians. They forced them to keep the system running. Henri Bosmans, the quiet clock repairman, was suddenly responsible for maintaining the timekeeping devices that synchronized German troop movements across occupied Belgium. The Nazis had put their entire war machine on his workbench. For 2 years, he studied their schedules. He memorized train routes. He observed how dispatchers relied on station clocks to clear tracks and issue movement orders. He learned which minutes mattered most. And in April 1943, he decided to move a single one, just one, enough to kill hundreds, enough to cripple an entire supply line, enough to prove that time, when wielded correctly, was more deadly than any gun. Henri Bosmans never wore a uniform, but every morning he went to war. His small repair kit, a leather pouch holding screwdrivers, brass tweezers, oil droppers, and gear pullers, was more dangerous than a pistol. With it, he could open any railway clock in Belgium. And those clocks governed the flow of Nazi power. German occupation forces had a simple doctrine. If trains ran on time, the Reich advanced. Fuel, tanks, soldiers, artillery, food, everything traveled by rail. Delays meant broken offensives. Misconnections meant divisions arriving too late to matter. A single unscheduled stop could ripple into days of chaos. That was the world Bosman stepped into each time he was called to service a clock. He was officially registered as a railway time technician. He wore a German-issued badge. He carried papers signed by the Reichsbahn, the Nazi rail authority. Guards waved him through checkpoints. Officers nodded at him without suspicion. He was invisible in the most valuable places in occupied Europe. Inside the clock housings, he found the true heart of the war. Every station had a master clock that synchronized all others on the line. Dispatchers checked it before allowing trains to enter a track section. Signal operators set green or red based on what time the next train was expected to pass. If the master clock was wrong, everything downstream became wrong with it. Bosmans didn't need to destroy the clocks. He only had to lie with them. Sometimes he would advance a clock by 2 minutes. Sometimes he would slow one by 90 seconds. The changes were so small they went unnoticed, until two trains believed they were both supposed to be on the same piece of track at the same moment. But Bosmans was careful. He didn't do it often. One derailment might be blamed on faulty brakes. Two might be chalked up to bad rails. But a pattern would trigger investigations. So he waited, he watched, he struck only when the stakes were highest. He also had help. The Belgian resistance provided him with German timetables, troop movement schedules, and high-value targets. They would tell him when elite divisions were moving, when munitions convoys were rolling, when oil tankers were on the line. Bosmans would then make tiny surgical adjustments at key junction clocks. The trains would do the rest. One famous incident occurred near Leuven, when a fuel train was delayed just enough to enter a single track section while a troop transport was still there. The resulting crash didn't just kill soldiers. It destroyed thousands of liters of fuel desperately needed for German operations in northern France. Berlin blamed Belgian rail workers. They blamed sabotage. They blamed accidents. They never blamed time. Bosmans would go home after each mission and sit quietly at his kitchen table, cleaning his tools. He didn't celebrate. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done. In his mind, he wasn't killing men. He was breaking a machine that was murdering his country. Each click of a misaligned gear was an act of resistance. Each shifted minute was a bullet. And the Nazis, obsessed with order, never realized the very thing they trusted most was being turned against them. The April 1943 collision was not an accident. It was the most precise act of sabotage in the Belgian resistance. The target was a heavily guarded supply route between Cologne and the French coast. Every day, two major convoys passed through a narrow single-track corridor outside Mechelen. One traveled west, carrying fresh soldiers and equipment. The other traveled east, bringing wounded troops and empty wagons back toward Germany. They were never supposed to be on that stretch at the same time. Bosman studied the master clock at the Mechelen switching station for weeks. He knew exactly when each train was scheduled to enter and exit the corridor. He knew how long it took for dispatchers to clear signals based on that time. And he knew how much deviation the system could tolerate before collapsing. The answer was less than 3 minutes. On April 14th, he was summoned to inspect the station clock after a routine maintenance report. German guards watched him unlock the brass casing. They saw him oil the gears. They saw him check the pendulum. They did not see him adjust the escapement. With one careful twist, he caused the clock to run exactly 90 seconds slow. That was all. The next morning, the eastbound train entered the corridor, believing it was still early. The westbound train was cleared by a dispatcher who trusted the clock on his wall. Both received green signals. Two machines, guided by the same false time, accelerated toward each other. There was no warning. The collision occurred at nearly 100 kilometers per hour. The first impact crushed the lead engines together, but the true horror came seconds later, when carriages piled into the wreckage. Fuel tankers ruptured. Ammunition cars detonated. Fire engulfed the entire train line. German rescue crews couldn't even approach for hours. When the smoke cleared, the rail corridor was destroyed. The line was closed for weeks. Dozens of scheduled convoys were canceled. Entire divisions were stranded. The Allied invasion of Italy that summer benefited directly from German supply disruptions traced back to that single Belgian track. But Berlin never knew the cause. They investigated sabotage. They interrogated workers. They replaced some clocks. Bosmans quietly reset the Mechelen clock back to normal time 2 days later. No one ever suspected the man who fixed it. The Nazis could imagine bombs. They could imagine spies. They could imagine guns and grenades and explosives. They could not imagine a clock killing 600 men. Yet, that is exactly what happened. Time, weaponized by a man who understood its gears, had become the deadliest instrument on the railway. After Mechelen, the German High Command was terrified. A single accident had annihilated more troops than many battlefield engagements. Rail security was tightened. Guards were doubled. Investigators from the Gestapo were dispatched to Belgium to uncover what they believed must be an underground bomb network. They never thought to look at the clocks. Instead, they arrested track workers. They tortured switch operators. They interrogated signal technicians. Anyone who had been on duty that night was dragged into prison cells and beaten for answers they didn't have. Bosmans watched this unfold with quiet horror. He knew he had caused a disaster. He also knew that if the truth was discovered, hundreds more would die. The resistance urged him to flee, to hide, to stop. He refused. "If I stop," he told them, "the trains keep killing people." So he changed his tactics. Rather than creating massive collisions, he began targeting delays. A troop train might be held 5 minutes too long. A fuel convoy might arrive after a connecting route had already closed. Artillery shipments would miss their departure windows. German commanders would rage at inefficiency without ever knowing the cause. Each small error multiplied. A tank division might reach the front a day late. An airfield might run short of gasoline. A battalion might go hungry. All because one man was quietly nudging time out of alignment. The Gestapo, growing desperate, decided the sabotage must be technological. They brought in German engineers to inspect the rail infrastructure. The experts found no explosives, no damaged tracks, no obvious tampering. The clocks were never examined. Bosmans continued to service them, under the watchful eyes of German guards who thought they were protecting them from sabotage. In reality, they were guarding the weapon. By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced into Belgium, German rail operations collapsed entirely. When British troops entered Antwerp, they found railway offices filled with broken schedules, missed departures, and unexplained system failures stretching back years. One officer later remarked that it was as if the entire Nazi rail network had been cursed. It had, by a clockmaker who understood that war is not always won by force. Sometimes it is won by minutes. Henri Bosmans did not survive the war as a hero. He survived as a ghost. After Belgium was liberated, he returned to his shop in Antwerp. He repaired watches. He fixed mantel clocks. Customers came and went. No one knew that the quiet man behind the counter had destroyed more German military power than many armed resistance cells. He never spoke of what he had done. There were no medals, no interviews, no official recognition. The Belgian government, focused on rebuilding a shattered nation, had no records of a clock sabotage unit. The resistance kept his identity secret to protect him, and Bosmans himself believed that time should erase what time had enabled. He died in 1968. His story only emerged decades later, when German railway archives were declassified. Investigators studying inexplicable transport failures in occupied Belgium noticed a pattern. Key junctions showed repeated micro-timing discrepancies. All were serviced by the same technician, Henri Bosmans. Historians piece together how often his maintenance visits preceded major disruptions. Survivors of the resistance confirmed the rumors. Slowly, the truth came into focus. The Nazis had not been fighting saboteurs. They had been fighting time itself. Today, Bosmans remains largely unknown outside specialist history circles. There are no statues of him, no films, no popular books. Yet his impact is undeniable. He proved that modern warfare depends not just on weapons, but on synchronization, on clocks, on the invisible systems that hold armies together. And he showed that those systems can be turned into weapons by someone who truly understands them. A single man, a single screwdriver, a single minute out of place. That was enough to bring trains full of Nazis crashing into oblivion, and history, ticking forward, barely noticed. In modern war, people think about guns, bombs, tanks, and planes. But the Nazis had built something even more powerful, a system. Their entire military ran on coordination, so precise that even a small disruption could send shockwaves through an entire front line. Trains had to arrive exactly when scheduled. Supplies had to be transferred within minutes, and troops had to be in the right place at the right hour. Time was not just measured, it was enforced. Henri Bosmans understood this better than anyone. Every railway clock was part of a vast nervous system. One clock in Antwerp connected to another in Leuven, which synchronized with Brussels, which aligned with Cologne. If one went wrong, everything downstream followed it into error. It was like pushing a single domino and watching a continent stumble. What made Bosmans' method so devastating was that it was invisible. A bomb leaves debris. A cut wire leaves evidence. A broken track can be repaired. But a wrong minute looks like human error. A late dispatcher. A careless signalman. A tired clerk. The Germans were obsessed with efficiency. They punished workers for delays. They fired supervisors. They replaced engineers. But nothing ever fixed a problem, because the problem was time itself. Bosmans often adjusted clocks by just a few seconds per day. Over a week, those seconds became minutes. Over a month, they became chaos. Trains would slowly drift out of synchronization, missing junctions, colliding at crossings, or being forced to halt when they should have passed. The brilliance of this strategy was that it created doubt. German officers stopped trusting their own schedules. They accused one another of incompetence. They ordered endless audits. They wasted time investigating phantom errors. And all of that time was stolen by one man. As the Allies pushed toward Normandy, German logistics became increasingly erratic. Supplies meant for panzer divisions arrived late. Fuel convoys missed their windows. Entire rail corridors shut down because no one could explain why trains kept conflicting. Those failures didn't happen on the battlefield. They happened in quiet rooms where clocks ticked. Bosmans never saw a soldier fall. He never watched a train explode. But he knew what his actions caused. And he accepted that burden because in his mind, every delayed Nazi train meant fewer bombs falling on Belgian cities. Time, the thing everyone takes for granted, had become his blade. The most astonishing part of Henri Bosmans' story is not what he did. It is how long he got away with it. The Gestapo had informants everywhere. They monitored resistance cells. They tapped phones. They infiltrated rail unions. They tortured suspects until false confessions poured out. Yet Bosmans, operating at the center of German logistics, was never even questioned. Why? Because the Nazis never believed something so simple could destroy something so complex. They assumed sabotage had to be violent, explosive, dramatic. They imagined commandos time bombs and rail bridges collapsing. They could not imagine a man quietly turning a brass screw. German investigators studied train wrecks and saw physics. They saw broken couplings, overheated brakes, faulty rails. They blamed weather. They blamed stress. They blamed sabotage teams that never existed. They did not blame the clocks because the clocks were German property. They trusted them, and Bosmans made sure never to do anything that looked suspicious. He never broke a clock. He never left scratches. He never made a sudden large change. His work was indistinguishable from maintenance. To the guards watching him, he was a technician doing his job. To the Reich, he was invisible. The resistance later said that Bosmans' greatest weapon was not his knowledge, but his patience. He waited months for the right moment. He watched entire train schedules unfold. He chose when to strike based on maximum impact. A weapons convoy might pass through 5 times without incident. On the 6th time, the clock would slip. The Germans would never know why that day was different. That uncertainty made them paranoid. And paranoia, in a war machine, is fatal. After the war, Europe was filled with monuments to generals and armies, but there were no statues for technicians. Henri Bosmans returned to obscurity, while others were celebrated. Yet the rail networks he had disrupted told a silent story. Allied logistics officers studying captured German records found patterns of mysterious failures across Belgium. Failures that aligned with moments when Nazi divisions desperately needed supplies. Historians now believe Bosmans' sabotage may have delayed multiple German counteroffensives by days, even weeks. In war, those delays can change everything. A delayed fuel train might mean tanks don't reach a battle. A delayed troop convoy might mean a city falls. His war was fought in minutes. Today, military strategists study systems warfare, the idea that modern conflict is about disrupting networks rather than destroying armies. Henri Bosmans was doing that decades before the term existed. He was not fighting soldiers. He was fighting the system that fed them. And he won more often than anyone realized. Most resistance fighters carried guns. Bosmans carried time. His story reminds us that heroism doesn't always look like a battlefield. Sometimes it looks like a man with grease on his fingers and a screwdriver in his pocket. He didn't shout. He didn't fire. He didn't bleed. He adjusted. In doing so, he turned the Nazis' greatest strength, their obsession with precision, into their greatest weakness. Every perfectly planned schedule became a trap. Every synchronized departure became a gamble. The Reich ran on clocks, so he broke them. In the end, Henri Bosmans never saw the trains he destroyed, but time saw them. Every minute he shifted pulled the Nazi war machine further out of alignment. Every delayed convoy weakened their grip on Europe. Every collision, every misconnection, every lost hour brought the end of the Third Reich closer. The most powerful weapon in Belgium was not a gun. It was a clock, and in the hands of one quiet man, it became history's most elegant act of sabotage. If this story amazed you, hit like, subscribe, and step into forgotten shadows of history with the Crit Stories.